support these initiatives. Having said that, let me also reiterate at this stage that all this has not happened overnight. This was made possible because of very strong fundamentals, including the modern facilities and well-trained manpower, which were already put in place several years ahead. In India, it is largely led by the private companies like Serum Institute, Bharat Biotech, BioE, Panacea Biotech, Zydus Cadila, and several others. While in China, it was both private and state-owned companies like Sinovac and Sinopharm. And in Brazil, it is largely driven by the public sector companies, that is Butantan and Biomanagers. So I would say that factors which have really created this enabling environment for these companies were world-class state-of-the-art GMP vaccine manufacturing facilities, because that is why the ramping up was much easier and faster. A skilled and trained manpower, which has been experienced in absorbing the new technology. And this was the point Mr. Patrick Tipu also emphasized, because this is one of the most critical factor. It is not only the IP part of it, but it is the know-how and it is the absorption of technology by the recipient, which will really make the difference in translation into a vaccine. The third thing is the innovation and voluntary technology transfers, and I have just shared with you several examples that have happened. So in my opinion, the African Union is on the cusp of a exponential growth, where these countries were way back, in 70s and 80s, I would say, with very high dependence on imports, and they were manufacturing only few EPI vaccines. But then, they transformed within last 10, 15 years to manufacture new and innovative vaccines like combination vaccines, flu vaccines, PCV, that is the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, HPV, and several others. So utilizing the learnings from these countries and companies, and also COVID-19, which has taught us clearly that nothing is impossible, and that timelines can be shrunk if we really want to do it. So with the latest technology and resources which are available now in plenty, maybe the African Union can do it in much shorter time compared to what other companies and countries have done. And what is needed is to create, and I echo here what Patrick said earlier, to create an ecosystem and enabling environment, especially in terms of strong, not only political, but also the bureaucratic will. Otherwise, any initiative and program of this magnitude will not be able to fructify. Also, the creation of a very high-powered ICC, which is the Interagency or Inter-Country Coordination Committee, that would be required because we have several countries coming together, and there will be several challenges that will come along with that. Then, of course, is the funding, and I am not just talking funding, I am talking sustainable funding and investment support to indigenous vaccine industry, which is the key to success. Strategic win-win collaborations with developing country vaccine manufacturers, as also the IFPMA members, with attractive incentives to the partners. So it is not only the indigenous industry, but also the partners have to be incentivized to make sure that there is a win-win relationship. And then the harmonized regulatory processes, because this is going to take the maximum time in terms of turning a technology into a reality or into a vaccine product. And that is where I think, including clinical trials, this has to be made faster and a harmonized regulatory process has to be created. The point I would like to make here is that if viruses don't recognize boundaries, then why vaccines should recognize boundaries? So I think we need to encourage entrepreneurs. There's no doubt about it, because they are the growth engine of any country. And it goes without saying that it is not only the planning at the highest level, but it is the micro planning, monitoring and leveraging the technology, which is going to be the key. I would say it has to be a step-by-step process and approach. And I must say that what Dr. Nikinga Song the Director Africa CDC, just has shared, the roadmap and the timelines which he has specified are very, very practical, and I think it is achievable. We are all with you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Well, thank you. Thank you not only for outlining to us these lessons, which we appreciate, but also for being available in the absence of Mr. Sai Prasad. Can I check whether Dr. Wali has been able to rejoin us and whether he's able to take the floor? Not hearing from him, I'm going to continue. And as soon as we know that Dr. Wali is on the platform, I would really like us to have an opportunity for him to speak. So I'm going to ask the next two panelists to share their views, to give us their thoughts on the potential to ramp up capacity in the short term. We've heard what are the challenges, we've heard some of the lessons, we've had some very interesting ideas about what are the prerequisites, and now what do we do as a first step to immediately ramp up capability? And I will call first Mr. Stavros Nikolai, followed by Dr. Amadou Alpha Sal. Stavros Nikolai is the Senior Executive of Aspen Pharmacare in South Africa. And Mr. Nikolai, your company, Aspen, is producing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in South Africa. And the production plant is intended to become one of the largest production facilities of its type when the full rollout begins. Given Africa's demand for COVID-19 vaccines in the short term and the already established capacity of countries like South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Senegal to make vaccines, in your view, what are the short-term opportunities specifically relevant to COVID-19 manufacturing of vaccines? How do you think about sustaining these investments in the long term? We have an immediate spike in demand now. What is your thinking about how to balance that with longer term needs? Because your investment will clearly be building long-term capability. And I want to then connect it with something that Rajinder Sir said. He spoke about transfer of technology and repurposing state-of-the-art facilities. What has been the lessons from Aspen Pharmacare that you would like to share with us? Stavros, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-moderator Minister Ibrahim Patel and your fellow co-moderator Mrs. Finda Karama, Excellencies, heads of institutions, ministers, and all esteemed colleagues. Firstly, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much, Minister and the organizers, for this opportunity. It is indeed a great privilege and a pleasure for Aspen to participate in today's very important conversations, which of course have far-reaching consequences for our continent. At the outset, Minister, you ask an excellent question, and I'm going to preface my response with a comment that is probably obvious, but requires repeating time and time again, particularly given the audience that we have. And, you know, when we deal as industry, we tend to resonate a lot more with the trade and industry ministers than we do perhaps with the health ministers when it comes to the topic of industrialization. So I'm particularly pleased that we have a good mix of ministers across finance, trade and industry, and health today. Prefacing my response, of course, is manufacturing is all about economies of scale and sustainability of those economies of scale. If we don't have economies of scale and those economies are not sustainable, we will not succeed. No manufacturing company anywhere on the planet would succeed. And it's been a significant failing of our continent, and that's why speaker after speaker today has referred to the significant trade deficit in pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and vaccines that continues to afflict, and to many, they would say that continues to disfigure the public health systems of our continent. We cannot any longer sustain this continuous dependency on imports, particularly in the face and in the midst of the pandemic that we are witnessing today, and for that matter, any future pandemic. So the question then becomes, in responding to your question, Minister, how do we look at short-term opportunities and sustainability? We can only do that if one of three things happen. And I'm going to talk more in practical terms. I'm talking practically as a company, Aspen, that is 23 years old. And in 23 years, we've gone from a regional South African player, where we were not even present in all the provinces of South Africa. We had designs around KwaZulu-Natal and one or two other provinces at a consumer level. We've now built a business that is a global business that is one of the largest suppliers of what are complex to manufacture, general anesthetic products, by way of example. And it was quite telling in the first wave of the pandemic, Minister Patel, that usually we're the ones that are phoning Europe and North America and Asia to get products. Well, the reverse happened during the pandemic, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way whatsoever, and neither was I or am I being insensitive to the public health crisis that the world was facing. But this time around, we had heads of state of countries like Italy and France phoning us and asking and pleading for anesthetic and other products that are used for ventilation. So that's a reverse of fortune. Now, why am I saying that? I'm not saying this to brag in any way. I'm saying it with all humility, because the message I want to leave is that it is possible for our continent to pull this off. But it's going to require the following three things. So let me get into these three things, which will speak directly to your question. The first is we need to start believing in our own capabilities and our own worth. It's interesting to see as you travel across the continent, and I experienced this in the earlier days of my career. I was the head of Aspen's export business, and I'd fly into an African country and say, we must support Africa, and we've got to support African companies. Then when I'm flying out, I'd meet the same managing director of this local company at the airport, and he'd tell me he's off to France. Why are you off to France? Well, I'm off to secure a deal for products. So we need to shed our own Afro-pessimism. I think that's the first thing, and believe that it can be done. The second thing, which is the most important thing, is you can only get economies of scale if your own, and most of the pharmaceuticals on our continent are procured by governments and donor agents. If our own governments and donor agents support local manufacture through long-term agreements with guaranteed offtakes, we will continue to see investors in the continent. Right now, when you're importing everything and there's no real support for localization or local efforts, it becomes very difficult to attract and or to retain investors. If you cannot do that, no sustainable offtakes, no guaranteed offtakes, you will not have economies of scale, you will not succeed. So we need to put once and for all to bed this thing that we need to, we want to support local, but then the next minute we're busy importing all these drugs because there's a R1 or a $1, or whatever the case is, price difference. There is a price to be paid for localization, but the benefit of security and supply, particularly when you're faced with a pandemic like this, and the multiply effect back into economies far exceeds what you would be paying by way of a premium, if you do pay a premium at all. Now, my final comment is, Minister, we have to start somewhere. India is a good case study, and I'm pleased we've got some of our Indian colleagues on this call. In the 70s, India was faced with the same issue. They had to back certain sectors, and they landed up backing RCT and pharma. But they had to start somewhere. They were not immediately competitive. They started off at base level, but they had a plan and they executed on that plan. And then they started moving up and up the value chain, where they're now in a position where they're doing R&D. we need to have that same conviction on our continent. That same conviction means that you will eventually start moving up that value chain. And that's where I see the most immediate short-term opportunity right now as we speak, Minister, is to identify, we've got 10 vaccine manufacturers on the continent. We cannot just confine the discussion to vaccines. We've got to expand it beyond vaccines into pharma and medical equipment. We need to identify more of these facilities, leverage the volumes regionally and the entirety of the continent, and look to see how we leverage those volumes into what are domestic manufacturing plants across the continent. So we start establishing these economies of scale and we build from there. Thanks very much, Minister, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nicolau, for those remarks, and particularly for the emphasis on the importance of partnership and long-term thinking by us in the public sector. It's my pleasure next to give the floor to Dr. Amadou Alpha Sall, who is the director of the Institute Pasteur de Dakar of Senegal. And in introducing his question, I want to say, Dr. Sall, that vaccine manufacturing is clearly a long-term venture. It requires careful planning and deep thought. Dr. Nicolai gave some example of some of the issues. In your view, and from the experience in Senegal, what are some of the key activities that needs to be prioritized now for sustainable long-term vaccine manufacturing? For example, what do we need to do immediately on skills, on intellectual property, on technology, and on funding? Are there some lessons that you'd like to share with us? Dr. Sall, you have the floor. Yes, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start by thanking all the organizers to bring all these key players into these discussions, and for these days actually to focus on Africa vaccine manufacturing. This is a very important subject, particularly in the context. And I just want to also to thank African Union and Africa CDC for their leadership since the beginning of this COVID-19. The perspective I'm going to give is from a manufacturer that has been doing vaccine manufacturing for yellow fever vaccine for 80 years in African continents, and also being pre-qualified by WHO since 1966, 54 years. The reason why I'm bringing these long time in perspective is just that it gave us the opportunity to learn a lot about key major challenge and how from the lesson we can accelerate the process. Over these last 30 years, Institut Pasteur de Dakar has managed to provide 200 million doses of yellow fever in different countries in Africa and also at the global level. The reason why we have been able to do that, even though very important achievement, but also could have been much better, was really due to the different challenge that we have to face and to which I've been touching, and from which we learn a very important lesson that are very helpful to put an accelerated process to face the problem with COVID-19. What are those difficulties? It's obviously about workforce. It's about being able to learn about technology. It's about to handle regulatories. And all this important information has been put together into building a great consortium to be able to leverage new technology, to leverage about new capacities when it comes to building, when it comes to manufacturing, at the same time to regulatory, to be able to deliver early next year capacities to do more than 200 million doses for 2022 for COVID-19. The reason why I'm really focusing on those leveraging technology is that we need to have some accelerated approach when we try to do this COVID-19 work. And this accelerated approach is something that we learn not only from the vaccine perspective, but also we've learned it through the diagnosis process. At the very beginning of this epidemic, we start collaboration with Mologic, with key players like FINE, to try to bring COVID-19 diagnostic, which was of utmost importance early in the process. And this could be done within less than a year. And today, this is fully functioning. And what we've learned also through that process is acceleration is possible, but it has to be well sought, and it has to be really grounded on the asset that people have and have the great people around the table. So to build that strategy, we had actually made sure that we bring the world top experts and all the different intelligence and the support of the government together. That's why our ministry earlier announced this initiative that we are putting together, that's going to be supported by several partners, technical and financial partners, to be able to do in the short term this activity where we need to have COVID-19 vaccine for Africa, because as John rightly said earlier, today we are producing less than 1%, and we need to accelerate this process, not only for COVID, but in the future. Coming to that, again, to your questions, I think very important aspect in planning is really to make sure that we are actually thinking in terms of breakthrough process, because doing business as usual showed clearly that this is not what's going to solve the problem. So we're really counting on having not only good planning, long-term view, but have to use also some approach with leapfrog models, where all these new technology like RNA messenger or all these viral vectors should be put together in a very flexible approach to be able to take opportunity to get all of them. Number two is really in terms of planning, to plan for long-term funding and have partners that would be committed to do that over the long term. And it's not just about putting money on regular basis, but it's also about building business models that are very relevant to Africa. Most of the time, we need to understand that African market have specificity, and thinking the business model in a way that would help being financially sustainable, at the same time, make high quality products with affordable access would be something that is critically important. And that's where the value of partnership is important in order to put together around the table, not only DFI, but also put together great foundations that are supporting this initiative, at the same time mobilizing some domestic funds and some few fiscal advantage to help the whole system to be able to deliver the promise that we all know need to be done, and very rightly actually clearly defined by John. To go to the long term again, what is important is that we have to realize is probably Africa is the area where emerging disease is really something that we live in routine. We've heard about Zika, we've heard about Ebola. These are like initially virus, and we have tens of them lying here that may be challenges for actually the future. So having good R&D platform to be able actually to develop those vaccines, have a proper evaluation of their capacity from the clinical point of view is really a key pillar. We need to strengthen Africa R&D. And in this regard, I'm really, really happy and excited about the CARI initiative brought by NIH and several key players of World Trust, because this is really trying to make R&D innovation some sort of DNA in research center to be able to feed with vaccines, some that are very specific in Africa, to our manufacturing capacity. And this is absolutely critical. The last thing I think, which is very important, is we need a lot of coordination. I see a lot of ambition and enthusiasm of making vaccine, but vaccine is about ecosystem. Vaccine is about capacity that need to be built over time. And obviously workforce in this regard is critical. And to talk about the workforce aspect, it's critically important that we try to leverage a diaspora where we have amazing capacities from Africa that are around the world that can bring those capacities into Africa and help actually to build the system and expand the capacity. To the point of coordination, it's critically important, like we have to this meeting, to have African Union and Africa CDC to take that lead. I think that the performance of Africa when it comes to COVID-19 has been really, really actually a success, in the sense that all our African leaders came with this African COVID task force, and that has been amazingly executed by Africa CDC in partnership with WHO and others. And this coordination that John was mentioning about platform and hubs from which we can build in different regions capacity to be able to provide vaccine to everybody seems to me critical. The coordination is really key, and this is absolutely important. With that, I think I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, to leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think your comments have been rich in ideas and some insights, for which I thank you. And we now come to our final two panelists who will speak to the potential long-term opportunities, which has already been picked up earlier in the conversation. And I'll first call on Professor Marufi, followed by Dr. Makwana. Professor Abdurrahman Marufi is Director, Institut Pasteur de Maroc, from Morocco. And we're really pleased to have you here, Professor. We have a stronger need in the world for vaccine manufacturing. That has been the theme running through the discussion here. Dr. Tipu and Mr. Rajinder Sur picked up on that. Dr. Sal made the same point. Now, given that you've heard today strong expressions of support for that, what should be our level of aspiration to ramp up existing capacity on the continent for the medium to long term? What kind of products should we be looking at? Is it just vaccines? What about the rest of the production ecosystem? And what kind of timeframes do you think we need to be planning for? Over to you, Professor Marufi. It's my pleasure to welcome you.
Merci beaucoup, Son Excellence, honorable assistance, mesdames et messieurs. Je voudrais tout d'abord exprimer mon immense gratitude aux organisateurs, la Commission de l'Union africaine et le CDC Africa de m'avoir associé à cet important forum et les féliciter vraiment pour le choix de cette thématique, de ce type de discussion et de mécanismes continentaux qui touchent un problème extrêmement prioritaire pour notre continent. Si vous permettez, Monsieur le Président, je voudrais un peu faire mes recommandations par rapport à cette question que vous avez soulevée à travers l'expérience que nous sommes en train de vivre au niveau du Maroc. Alors, tout d'abord, le premier point, en ce qui concerne les opportunités ou les choses peut-être à faire pour pouvoir améliorer notre capacité au niveau continental pour la production à long terme au niveau vaccinal. L'expérience que nous sommes en train de vivre au Maroc, il me semble, il y a pas mal d'idées qu'on pourrait partager. Premièrement, si on regarde le paysage de production industrielle au niveau de la vaccination au Maroc, il y a une production locale assurée pour l'instant avec l'Institut Pasteur du Maroc, qui est un établissement pharmaceutique public. Du côté du secteur privé, il n'y a aucune production qui est faite, malgré que nous avons un tissu industriel pharmaceutique qui est très développé au niveau continental. Je pense que le tissu industriel pharmaceutique privé au Maroc est peut-être le deuxième au niveau continental, mais il n'est pas impliqué dans la production, il n'est pas actif dans la production de vaccins. Pourquoi? Quand on les interroge, je leur demande pourquoi, en fait, l'idée derrière, c'est la question d'accès au marché des vaccins. Alors, le marché de vaccins au Maroc, comme dans beaucoup de pays, 80% essentiellement est assuré par l'État. Et pour pouvoir acheter et vendre à l'État, il faut passer par des mécanismes d'appel d'offres et des mécanismes un peu de concurrence avec des industriels et des multinationales. Donc, il y a une hésitation au niveau du secteur privé industriel pharmaceutique. Il hésite beaucoup à investir dans la production des vaccins parce qu'il y a justement ce manque de garantie et d'assurance pour l'accès au marché. Alors, le mécanisme qu'on a trouvé, que nous sommes en train d'implanter dans notre pays pour pouvoir justement contourner cette barrière et cette peur qui existe au niveau du secteur industriel privé, c'est le mécanisme de PPP, partenariat public-privé. Donc, le Maroc a développé un cadre réglementaire très développé pour faciliter et favoriser les mécanismes et les contrats vraiment de partenariat public-privé. Donc, ce qui est en train de se faire maintenant, l'Institut Pasteur, en tant qu'établissement pharmaceutique public, est en train de tisser des contrats de partenariat public-privé pour permettre justement, et c'est ça l'avantage de ce mécanisme, à travers justement ces contrats publics-privés, le privé pourrait développer son activité industrielle et accéder au marché et à l'achat de ces vaccins par l'État. Donc ça, c'est un mécanisme qui me semble extrêmement important, que je recommande beaucoup à promouvoir dans nos différents États et notre continent pour pouvoir faciliter et booster vraiment cette production vaccinale et son utilisation au niveau continental. Alors, deuxième point, ce cadre réglementaire devrait être vraiment souple. Le cadre réglementaire des PPP, quelque chose de souple, parce que nous avons expérimenté dans notre pays deux familles d'instruments réglementaires. Au début, il y avait un instrument qui était très lourd, où il faut vraiment passer par des appels d'offres, des mécanismes de négociation très longs, ce qui nous a amené à le réviser et à l'assouplir pour passer par des mécanismes beaucoup plus rapides, à type par exemple d'offres spontanées ou de négociation de contrats directement négociés avec des partenaires privés. Alors, dans ce type de système et de modèle qu'on est en train de mettre en place, la partie publique s'occupe de l'aspect recherche-développement et la partie privée, le partenaire privé, s'occupe de l'aspect production industrielle. Troisième recommandation extrêmement importante que je voudrais aussi partager, l'une des contraintes aussi qui vraiment empêche et qui fait une barrière au développement, surtout au début d'une stratégie industrielle vaccinale qui est progressive, c'est celui vraiment l'aspect du transfert de technologie. Donc actuellement, effectivement, on est à la recherche de beaucoup de partenaires pour le transfert de tech. Moi, je pense dans ce système de développement de la vaccination et de production vaccinale au niveau continental, c'est important de mettre en place des mécanismes et des outils qui vont faciliter le partenariat avec des organismes de transfert de tech qui sont souvent des multinationales. Et donc là, peut-être l'Union africaine, les États et même l'OMS, on tient à remercier l'OMS qui fait un effort aussi dans ce sens extraordinaire. Donc tous ces organismes et ces outils, je pense, peuvent jouer un rôle important pour faciliter dans la mise en place des mécanismes continentaux de transfert de tech. Le quatrième point, très important, le renforcement des organismes et des mécanismes et des agences de régulation pharmaceutique, que ce soit au niveau national ou au niveau continental. Donc, on a parlé ce matin beaucoup de l'Agence africaine pour les médicaments, mais aussi les agences au niveau des pays doivent être renforcées, notamment dans tout ce qui est contrôle de qualité des vaccins. Donc, c'est important qu'ils disposent des laboratoires de contrôle de qualité des produits vaccinaux qui sont produits, ce qui est extrêmement, vraiment important. Si vous permettez, Monsieur le Président, pour ne pas vraiment être trop
Chairperson, I don't want to take too long, but I would like to add another point, some recommendations regarding the question, through which product should we begin and what would be the scheduling or the time frame. I believe in terms of production, I believe that this should be concentrated on two types of products that I believe are very important. The vaccine products that are very expensive globally,
qui sont vraiment en augmentation de la demande,
and they are currently undergoing a huge increase, but they are very complex. The production is complex. I will give you an example. HPV, we have the vaccine against meningitis, among others. The second type of product that is very important is that would be useful for responding to the epidemiological threat against emerging diseases, and this concerns our continent. For example, the Ebola virus disease. We have rabies as well. And the reason I cite these are because this kind of products are very expensive at the global level. It's very hard to buy them because the demand is low and it is limited to a few countries simply because it's expensive. Secondly, within this family of priority products, priority for us in the continent, for example, the venom, anti-snake bite venom, these are products that are there. We have these sera. The serum is there. And this would provide specific medicine against snake bite kind of diseases. And we don't really find this. We need to, and we don't really, this is not very available on the world scene, but we need to prioritize this kind of production, which is very specific to the scorpions and other serpents that exist in our continent. Chairperson, those were a few ideas and recommendations that I wanted to share with you in the course of this very important and interesting session. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
15 minutes. Thank you.
And I would like to thank you for your contribution. Thank you very much for that, Professor Marufi. And that brings me then to the final panelist that we have here today, which is Dr. Rna Vaccines, who is the CEO of BioVac in South Africa. Dr. Vaccines, you've heard now this really interesting conversation here, and I think we all recognize that developing a vaccine manufacturing strategy is not a short-term initiative. Partnerships has been a big part of our focus and of our conversation, partnerships with the private sector. From your experience, listening to all of this, if Dr. John Nkengasong asked you, what is the single biggest thing that you think we should be doing on the continent now? The practical step we should be taking, what advice should you give? What advice should you give him? And what kind of time frames do we need to think about in developing not only manufacturing capability, but also R&D capability, and to have the capacity for quick response as new variants arise? So Dr. Vaccines, I'd like to welcome you to the floor.
Thank you, Minister Patel, and thank you also to Africa CDC for having invited us to this occasion. I'm very happy that at least a lot of my co-panelists have laid the scene for how difficult it is to set up vaccine manufacturing, and also for some of the ideas that have come through. I'd like to firstly preface by saying that vaccine manufacturing typically gets built not during a pandemic. It's in between pandemics. And by that, I'd like to actually argue and maybe advocate that this forum does not only end here, that in 2 years' time, once the pandemic is done, and in 4 years' time, and whenever...
Could we just ask everybody to mute? We would like to have the comments by Dr. Vaccines. Please, Dr. Vaccines, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. And so I was saying that vaccine manufacturing, when you look at it all over the world, gets built in between pandemics. And you need to have that sustainability in order to respond to a pandemic. So a lot of the companies that we see globally that we read about, have built technology and capability prior to the pandemic. Some of them were actually didn't build the capability for the pandemic, but they're utilizing the capacity that they have built. So I think it's important that we recognize the role that routine vaccines play in building vaccine manufacturing capability. For our own part as BioVac, that's what we have done and focused on pediatric vaccines. And we're able to partner with international companies in order to give us the know-how and build the skills to be able to manufacture vaccines. And so the message number one is that we need to build in between pandemics and not forget the momentum that we now have and the opportunity that we now have. Secondly, Africa does have capability, as a lot of the companies that have spoken prior have demonstrated that we do have capability, but we do need assistance. Therefore, what should we do? I think all crises have generated a few momentum. I mean, we know how World War II has helped in building countries like Japan and others. So some crises are not to be wasted. We know that in the late 90s, when it comes to vaccines, that there was a shortage of routine vaccines. And the likes of the Gavi Alliance was essentially born out of that crisis. And now Gavi is a large organization, but was born out of that crisis. We know that during the Zika and the Ebola crisis, that's one of the reasons how the likes of CEPI get to be established. And therefore, what I would urge is that we use this crisis and this pandemic to formally create an African vaccine momentum that would also look at procurement of vaccines on the continent. Maybe I can expand a little bit on what that would look like. I think it's important to recognize that it's going to be difficult for African vaccine manufacturers to compete with others that are already large scale, that are producing, multivalent products at less than $1 a dose, if I can just make practical examples. And therefore, we do need to be very deliberate in not creating or expecting the same thing that has come out of other continents or out of other initiatives. Countries and continents are 30 or 40 years ahead of us. And therefore, what we do need to create is we need to create an ecosystem, an enabler, and a deliberate one, and not to be shy of it and say, we want African vaccine manufacturing to happen, but how is that going to come in as an example from the demand side? We do need to have a purchaser as African vaccine manufacturer, and that should be our continent. Our continent is deemed as poor, but as a pool, we have the power. Most of what UNICEF supplies and Gavi supplies they're coming to the continent. And therefore, we do have some purchasing power, and therefore we should utilize that and create and be deliberate that as the AU or Africa CDC or any of the new initiatives that are being purported should be deliberate in saying we want to buy vaccines from African manufacturers. So the demand side is quite important. Secondly, we need to have innovative funding mechanisms. We cannot go to a traditional bank, as a small country and expect that we'll get all the funding. There have been previous innovative financing mechanisms that have been deliberate in creating and making products accessible. I'll make an example of the advanced purchase commitment that was created during when Gavi, UNICEF, and donors wanted to make the pneumococcal vaccine available. They entered into 10 or 15-year supply agreements with suppliers that had the pneumococcal vaccine technology. It then gave a business case for companies to continuously invest in manufacturing, and that's how we saw the likes of GlaxoSmithKline establish large manufacturing capacity in Singapore because of the likes of the advanced market commitment that was created. And so we therefore need to create those type of mechanisms and say, so that African manufacturers can have line of sight, so that we can go and raise funding and we don't necessarily have to ask our own governments for funding. Funders would be able to fund vaccine manufacture if there's line of sight in terms of demand. And if the demand can come from the continent, and we can be very deliberate about how it's going to come, that will build a sustainable business case. But we do need to have a 10 or 15-year vision. If this cannot happen in 5 years, we do need to have a 10 or 15-year vision. And what that does not mean that we exclude partners from others. As I said, we have been able to attract technology transfer. We have many companies that have presented that have been able to partner with others. The last point that I'd like to make is that we also need to think about innovative funding mechanisms we have seen in other industries. I think for South Africans, they would know how in many years ago, there was the coal supply to the state-owned electricity company, where there was a cost-plus model, where you would enter into 10, 15-year agreements on a cost-plus model that sustained coal mining, and at the same time supplied what was seen as cost-effective coal. In that way, there was a win-win situation. And therefore, what I'm pleading is that we break away from the typical way of doing things and rather come up with extremely innovative ways that would have sustainability, where we would have 10 or 15-year vision. And I think with this momentum, it's very possible to build some of those. But I think we need to have a formal establishment of this initiative, of this conference. We need to have a real tangible organization, either led by the AU or the Africa CDC, that would look at demand, that would create that mechanism. And in that way, manufacturing would then follow through, because there would be line of sight about who are we producing for, who are we, who are we supplying, and in that way we can create our own ecosystem. In that way, things like technology, skills, and others would follow suit. but we do need to create a demand, and we do need to create that carrot so that others can be able to follow. With this limited time, Minister, I will stop here.
And I'd like to thank you very much for those very, very helpful comments, particularly your opening remark that the tools that humanity use in any pandemic are the tools that are developed even before the pandemic, that we need to now prepare for whatever Africa and the world may need in future. We've heard from my eminent panel of speakers, lots of very useful insights, good ideas, a lot of convergence in thinking. And I want to invite the Africa CDC Deputy Director and my co-moderator, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell Umar, to offer some concluding comments and the big takeouts that he believes can assist the conclusions of this conference. And so, Dr. Umar, it's my pleasure really to give over to my co-host for those concluding remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Ibrahim, and a very big congratulations to the team of 7, eventually 6 eminent panelists who have taken us through this vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Very tough to be able to summarize that rich discussion, but I'll point out just a few things that I think can be able to drive this coming out of that rich discussion. First is vision. And I think the fact that we are here discussing this issue for the next 2 days is really testimony to the vision that our heads of states had to be able to put together continental vehicle like Africa CDC to address issues of health security. And in this way, we really do have a very clear vision that we need to be doing things for ourselves on this continent. But as we move forward, the issue of vision is going to really come through. Then I will group the next 6 or so items into that enabling environment or enabling ecosystem, as had been said by one of the presenters. And this includes things like R&D. What are we doing to invest in research and development? And what role is government playing in ensuring that there is some innovative funding around R&D, which will then give way to other partnerships that can be able to support that enabling environment for vaccine development to be able to take place. And the partnerships will come in the form of either technology or funding, but nevertheless, we need partnership, both with the, from the public sector side and also from the private sector side. Again, in this ecosystem, the enabling environment, technology, we really need to be leveraging on technology. We've seen how quickly technology has supported the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. And I think it is time for us to be able to take advantage of technology to leap, not to take as long as others did, but we can be able to leap into the future of vaccines if we leverage that. And then the third basket is really coordination on the continent. And I think this is extremely important, particularly with a very clear call that Dr. Morena has made there, that we not only need the African vaccine momentum, but we also need to formalize it. And that is going to need coordination. And Africa CDC and the Africa Union, we stand ready to be able to do this for the continent to take its rightful place globally. The fourth basket is the whole area of capacity building. It will be the experts that we need to train. It will be the technology that we need to ensure comes onto the continent. It will be the infrastructure we need to develop so that we are able to tackle whatever types of pathogens we need to address in terms of vaccine development. It will be the support that we need to get not only from our governments, but also from our intergovernmental organizations on the continent. So building capacity from many different aspects is really going to be key in the next steps. And I will end here, colleagues, by saying that it is time, and this is the message that is coming through, that it is time for Africa to be able to expand on what we have and therefore deliver before the next pandemic comes. and looking at how the level of discipline that we have as human beings going into caves, into forests, down under the sea, the next pandemic will take a much shorter time than these 100 years that we've seen from the Spanish flu to now the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to utilize this space and this crisis to be able to build on what we have and deliver on better preparedness on the continent for vaccine development. And with all the knowledge we have around animal vaccines production, I think we are not starting at zero. We are really starting at a good space, and all we need is to keep focused on the vision, and also to provide the required environment for us to be able to build this. So colleagues, it has been a very, very intense session. We are a bit late, and I will hand it over back to Chacha Mwita to take us into the next session. And I thank each and every one of you for staying during this session. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amt. That is a wonderful conclusion to that session. And thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you for the wonderful moderation of that session. What has come out from that session is simple. It is that it is time for Africa to take charge of its vaccine developments. We recognize that there are challenges, but we also recognize that there are opportunities, and there is potential both in the long and short term. It is possible, and it is time. Thank you very much. So I'll quickly transition with apologies that we cannot take questions again because of time. We are 30 minutes behind, and our next speakers are in the house and they've been waiting for quite some time. So it's my pleasure to introduce them to talk to us about partnerships to transfer technology to accelerate vaccine manufacturing in Africa. And they will explore technology options, or with, of course, pros and cons of each for Africa. They will tell us about African processes development capacity for technology transfer, and they will share with us lessons learned in Africa and globally on technology transfer, including strategic partnerships for the same, that is technology transfer. And to take us through this session are two co-moderators, namely Professor Salim Abdul Karim of Caprisa, South Africa. It's good to see you, Professor. And Professor Peter Piot of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Very great personalities. Thank you very much. And please welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you all here today. As we've heard, that in this session, we are here to help further Africa's development goals. And we've heard about the African Union's new public health order. And this is really about trying to protect Africa against the threat of infectious diseases. Now, we've seen very clearly in this morning's session a very concerning number, and that number was 1%. It just boggles the mind to think that our entire continent only produces 1% of the vaccines it requires. And so this vaccine dependence, where we are only producing such a small proportion of our vaccines, needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed so that we can build, a resilient healthcare system. So how do we do this? How do we build vaccine capacity? And how do we do so through one of the 4 pillars that we heard Dr. Nkengosong so eloquently espouse? And that particular pillar is about respectful, action-orientated partnerships. And as he described this particular approach, it's important that today in this session, we will try and flesh that out. We'll try and give it some substance, because we have with us today an amazing group of individuals who are clearly among the world's leading experts in vaccines. And so we will hear from them about, particularly because many of them are from the pharmaceutical sector, we will hear from them about how we might be able to redress this 1% number. So it's my great pleasure to invite my good friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Piot of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, to moderate the first part of today's session, and we've divided it up into two. He will moderate and deal with the session, dealing with the individual questions we will pose to each of the panelists. Thereafter, we'll take a short Q&A, and I will then do a wrap-up at the end of the session. So without further ado, Dr. Piot, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Slim, my good friend, and hello, everybody. I'm truly honored to co-chair this with Professor Abdul Karim, and we've been comrades in arms in the fight against AIDS for many years, and now there is the COVID pandemic. And I would like to pay tribute also to the African Union and particularly to the the Africa CDC and the ambitious and realistic approach that the director, Dr. John Nkengasong, has taken for this. And I truly hope that this summit will be a historic event. Because we've seen, going back to the 1%, but also to access, we know that scarcity is the enemy of equity. And the only way, I think, is really to make sure that Africa also has local capacity for manufacturing along the lines that were very well explained in the previous session. And I think it's now or never, because this is a matter of global health security. And if we collectively don't act now, I don't think it will happen. So this is the opportunity. And I think that key is partnerships and having those with experience in the field, but also others to work together so that when we have the next epidemic or before this one is over, that there will be enough vaccines for everybody. And it's a pleasure to start with to introduce our first speaker, Professor Andrew Pollard. Andy, are you there? Yes, I can see you from Oxford, who, as we all know, was or has been, I should say, instrumental in the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is part of one of the foundations of the COVAX program, and has been used now by millions in the world. And this is a new technology, just as we have for the Janssen vaccine and others in Russia and China. Andrew, with your experience, you've been working with new technologies, new approaches, but coming from a university and a startup, what is your advice? What are the most appropriate technology options for existing and emerging African manufacturers? What are the pros and cons? What's realistic? What is the long term and the short term? And why would we want to capitalize on them? So thanks so much for being with us. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you to the African Union and African CDC for inviting me to join today. Like Peter, I feel it's a real privilege to be here because this just may be the tipping point. In fact, it must be the tipping point for the building of manufacturing capacity across the African continent. And I think it'd be very exciting to be here as this conversation happens. I think the first thing that I would say is that it's making vaccines is tough. It's tough to do the development. It's even harder to do the bit that we're talking about, which is the manufacturing at scale to be able to produce. And just as a very brief history lesson in that regard, we just need to look back over the last year. To me, it feels like it's been about 10 years, but actually just looking back over the last year, at this moment, we have 87 vaccines that are in clinical development, about 180 that are still in preclinical development. We've had the major global manufacturers who make vaccines normally, all trying to get there to make vaccines. And yet at this point, we just have a handful of technologies that have reached this point where we're able to start the process of vaccinating the world. And if you look at that sort of huge financial and infrastructure and personnel capacity that there is in the normal manufacturing sector, it's only Pfizer at this moment, as a well-known vaccine producer globally, that is moving at pace in making vaccines at this point. And I think that really, to me, is a huge emphasis on just how difficult this process is. And so it really does have to be thought through very carefully about everything from the clinical development process, when you come to manufacturing, also what is the supply chain of the raw materials into the manufacturing, because it isn't just the capacity and the skills and the infrastructure and the plant, it's how you're going to get the raw materials that go in there. And then, as was said by one of the previous speakers, the demand end is critical in driving that. That is assuming you've got the investment there to start with. I think the other thing, really, Peter, that comes to the question that you're asking, which is really about perhaps which technologies should we go for? And I think the answer there is that you don't know which is the right technology. And the problem with development for this pandemic or for future pandemics, many of the products that start out will either fail or they won't achieve the investment that you need, and they won't get there. And that means that you have to have flexibility. You can't just have entire focus on one product. And what's been successful up to this point is where there has been investment in multiple technologies to make sure that at least one or two or even 5 of them are able to come to market in a pandemic to be able to then provide protection to populations. And at this moment, we essentially have 4 technologies that are being used in the global efforts to try to curb the pandemic. And the first of those are the RNA vaccines, which are a brand new technology with Pfizer and Moderna already approved by the World Health Organization and in multiple jurisdictions around the world, and are very exciting technology in that they should be very scalable. Some of the stability questions which clearly have been troubling at the beginning are things which will be solved. And so I think these are really exciting technologies that will in the future be translatable to other vaccine types. We are particularly lucky in some ways in this pandemic in that we're dealing with a virus that we know a lot about. We know about the protein, we know about its stability, and we knew which is the right target. And of course, this is another feature for future pandemics, that it might be that because of questions around protein folding, perhaps around the different delivery systems we're using today, that we just cannot use some of the technologies in the future. So again, a reason not to focus just in on one technology, but to have facilities for manufacturing that have some flexibility, and clearly scalability is critical. The second group of products were the viral vectors, which were mentioned from AstraZeneca, J&J, and from CanSino. And each of those have characteristics which also mean that they can be adapted, just as the RNA vaccines, to multiple different antigens. But again, we don't know for certain that with a different pathogen this would be successful. I've worked on some vaccines using viral vectors where it was impossible to get the protein to express in a way that produced the functional antibodies that were required, because of the way in which those proteins were expressed once they went through mammalian cells, maybe because of glycosylation. So it could be that there are enormous challenges even for future pandemics with RNA or viral vector vaccines. And we have to be alert to that possibility, that at this moment we don't have all of the structural knowledge that means that we can adopt these new technologies and put them into a future pandemic program. The protein vaccines that are coming on stream, hopefully in the very near future, tried and tested traditional approach for vaccines. And then, of course, we've got the inactivated vaccines, which at the moment, the two products being used in many countries come from China. And those four different technologies, the inactivated vaccines, protein, viral vectors, and RNA, are currently what we have in our armamentarium to try to tackle this pandemic. And I think that tells us that because we need to be able to respond to an unknown pathogen in the future, that we have to be in a position where we have enough flexibility to be able to pivot to those technologies which are successful with future threats. I mean, certainly at this moment, we have a number of different products which it should be possible to mirror those through other production facilities. Technology transfer from any of these should be possible in the year ahead. So if we're talking about short term, then I don't think there is a particular focus on a product. There are clearly some characteristics which may be advantageous, particularly around having strong neutralizing antibody responses and T-cell responses that we believe may be important for controlling this particular virus. But that may not always be the case with pathogens in the future. And so understanding which is the right technology for the particular response that's required may be an important future component for trying to decide how best to address the future threats. And of course, that means that we really have to have the thinking around this built on a platform of really strong science, so that we are making the right decisions, both about technologies and about selection of the right components for those technologies in the future. So, you know, I think to come to the question of what is needed, well, clearly you have to have investment. Here in Oxford, we had a technology, and what we got very early on was substantial investment from the UK government, which allowed me to get the clinical development program underway very early in the pandemic. And that has been critical to allow the speed of movement to get us to this point. But it's a very big task from being able to make small numbers of doses in our clinical manufacturing facility here in Oxford to the point that we're at now, where over 200 million doses have been distributed. And that heavy lift of upscaling manufacturing is something which really does require an enormous effort. And each manufacturing facility goes through a process of trying to optimize the production to be able to produce the doses at scale and to maintain quality in doing that. And I know from my history of working in vaccine development that often that is the biggest obstacle, is the upscaling process. And it may take years to do that for some products, to get that perfected so that there are good yields and a reproducible product at the end. So I think in terms of where to go, I think it's critical that where you go is flexibility and to have investment in the supply chain into manufacturing, the facility itself, the infrastructure, and the skilled personnel needed to run those. And I'll hand back to Peter.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This sets the scene very well, and also the flexibility and the need for multiple technologies. There is not a single solution. Let's move on because time is pressing, so that we have now Dr. Richard Hatchett, who is the Chief Executive of CEPI. And CEPI was born out of the West Africa Ebola epidemic now 7 years ago. And it was a bit ahead of its time, but fortunately we were there because you were the CEPI, I should say we, because I'm a board member, I should disclose, gave the first grants already for vaccine development. Must have been like mid-January during the World Economic Forum. So over to you, Richard, because you have a key role to play internationally also, but how do, does technology transfer fit into CEPI strategies? Which technologies are most relevant for Africa, and how can you support these And I think for the future and for everything we discuss here, CEPI has a key role to play. Over to you, Richard. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Professor Karim, for setting up this wonderful panel. Also want to thank Africa CDC. It's really an extraordinary conference, extraordinary group of people that John and Kingasong has brought together on this critical topic. And I think it speaks to the great appetite in Africa, but also the great goodwill and the tremendous support that the world will offer Africa as they seek to increase their capacity. Let me start, Peter, in answering your question just by saying, framing CEPI's mission, which is to accelerate vaccine development against emerging infectious diseases and enable equitable access to those vaccines for the populations that need them. We believe fully that in the long term, equitable access can best be achieved through strengthening capacities in countries at risk. I would say that COVID-19, I think we're all desperately aware that COVID-19 has revealed in the most profound way the need for equitably distributed vaccine manufacturing capacity. And that's why we're gathered here. That's why there's tremendous political will. But even before COVID-19 demonstrated this, CEPI was supporting technology transfer of vaccine manufacturing for emerging pathogens to low and middle income countries. I'll just cite one example. We were working with a partner, Valneva, to transfer drug product manufacturing of their chikungunya vaccine to the Butantan Institute in Brazil. And during the COVID response, we have also supported vaccine manufacturing globally, deliberately, to distribute that capacity globally to the greatest extent possible. We were seeking to achieve speed, scale, and access at the same time. Scale was very important, and that led to the selection of the initial manufacturing sites, but we recognized that even the initial manufacturing sites would not in and of themselves meet global needs. And so we very early on began supporting tech transfer activities to partners, including in India, in South Korea, and elsewhere, to increase that global manufacturing footprint. Many of those technology transfers, as I mentioned, occurred between manufacturers in high-income countries. I think that's true, but that was driven by this desire to achieve scale. We did recognize early on, though, as I said, the need for globally distributed manufacturing, and clearly the way the pandemic has played out, that we need more globally distributed manufacturing going forward. And ultimately, that means increasing manufacturing, particularly in developing countries. We've seen a number of developing country manufacturers really step up. Serum Institute of India, certainly Biological E, Biopharma Institute, Butantan, and Fiocruz all have taken on manufacturing of different vaccines. Just a few points to build on Andy's comments about the different manufacturing technologies. I absolutely concur with him on the need for diversity and the fact that future pandemics may not be as easily responded to in terms of the development of vaccines. We did benefit, as Andy said, from a lot of prior work on coronaviruses, on MERS in particular, and we're peculiarly well prepared to respond. And this virus has proved to be fairly easy given the number of technologies that are succeeding to develop a vaccine against. We going forward, and I think it's important for Africa in thinking about its continental strategy to recognize there is the technical challenge that we may encounter viruses like HIV that are much more difficult to develop vaccines against, and we always have to remember that. So having a diversity of approaches is important there. But even if the vaccines even if the virus that lends itself to vaccine development, very important to recognize all the risks that we might encounter in the process of an accelerated vaccine development program, including possible low efficacy. We've seen that with some of the vaccines, or lower efficacy with some of the vaccines, safety issues, that pop up. We are seeing that now with some of the vaccines and manufacturing challenges. That's just, assuming that supply chains are intact and that everybody has access to what they need to attempt to manufacture, there will be challenges. And then if you overlay the potential risk to supply chains, it just becomes really, really complicated. So in the continent's long-term interest, it is really, really going to be important to invest in a diversity of technologies, to have that flexibility, and to think about all the different kinds of risks that will need to be managed. Ultimately, I think many observers would agree that for Africa, it is obviously prudent to start in the short term by expanding drug product or fill and finish manufacturing capabilities, because expertise already exists in Africa to do this, and to potentially bring in new innovative technologies for filling. I'll just mention one example that CEPI's working on with the MedInstill multi-dose bag filling technology. We're supporting this and looking potentially to see about exploring transfer. And this would allow bags that could allow for up to 200 doses at a time to be filled, which would allow for very rapid filling. Regarding the drug substance manufacturing, depends on who you talk to. Experts have different opinions. Some would argue, that given the current constraints on upstream and downstream processing in Africa, probably sensible to start with less complex technology transfer, for example, with recombinant protein manufacturing. Others would argue for live viral vaccines. Others still would say that recent manufacturing innovations, and Stefan can possibly speak to this in a bit, might open up complete new possibilities for leapfrogging with mRNA technologies. Whatever the technologies that are transferred, I think it's going to need to be important that they also be suitable for meeting routine vaccination needs, to raise that 1% number that we've talked about, so that Africa can ultimately be more self-sufficient in terms of its own vaccine production, not only because self-sufficiency is important, but also so that you have a sustainable business model. I think Morena and Amadou and others have mentioned that. Just in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and wrap up. I will just mention one thing that CEPI has issued recently, which is we did surveys on drug product and drug substance manufacturing last year that helped guide some of our early actions. That information is long obsolete at this point. We now recently issued a request for information about vaccine manufacturing capacity and capability, trying to do a gap analysis. Just issued that on the 29th of March. Matthew Downham is our point of contact at CEPI on that. We've already heard back from a number of African vaccine manufacturers. We'd like to hear from all of them. And interestingly and encouragingly, all of the respondents thus far have described future planning and their aspirations to develop or expand their vaccine manufacturing capacities and capabilities. Everyone recognizes the importance of securing autonomous capability in Africa. I think there's, as I said when I began, there's a tremendous appetite within Africa to enhance that vaccine manufacturing capacity. CEPI sees this as critically important to future global preparedness, and we are committed in coming years to supporting that, with technical assistance in any way we can, looking for opportunities for Africa to step up and take charge of its own vaccine manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and for everything that you do.
Je vous remercie, Richard. Merci pour ce que vous faites aujourd'hui.
Panelist is Dr. Paul Stoffels.
Prochain intervenant, c'est Dr. Paul Stoffels. Il travaille avec Johnson et est très utile par rapport au vaccin Ebola qui a été utilisé plusieurs endroits d'Afrique.
Janssen COVID vaccine. So,
et ils sont également en œuvre ce qui est du vaccin contre la COVID. Ils sont basés en Sud et
more about how you do that. What are some of the critical factors that need to be in place to secure such technology transfer deals What are some of the challenges you see when thinking about the opportunity in Africa? Because people
sont certains défis parce que les gens parlent de
technology transfer
et
that is
autres
going to be key. So over to you,
par
Paul, and
rapport
thank you so much
à
for everything you're
Well,
doing.
thank you, Peter. And
je voudrais donc vous donner la parole. Donc, Paul.
very, very interested to learn and to discuss options for vaccine production in Africa. Also, more than that, vaccine development. And I think, let me go to a little bit of a case study on with our COVID vaccine and Aspen and how did we get it. First of all, it's about one vaccine platform. An Adeno 26, a live non-replicating vaccine-specific technology. But also, you need an optimized cell line that are optimized human cell line to produce this at very low levels. And that results at the moment in a single dose, very stable type of vaccine, which can be used for vaccination in Ebola, in COVID, and more to come. So we did a lot of research on the ground in Africa with different teams in different countries. For Ebola, in Sierra Leone, in DRC, still ongoing. In Rwanda, very large vaccination program, research program ongoing with the government in Rwanda. For HIV in South Africa, and for the COVID vaccine, also the team in South Africa was part of that. And that basis, you have to have a strong research community with capabilities which can help to develop vaccines, but also get them approved, and that builds on the know-how. Then on the, of course, totally different situation. For Ebola, we only produced 2 million vaccines up to now in between 2014 and now, and that is still a stock we have and which we are deploying today. So the quantities which are involved is so much different. The development started on 15. March 30, we selected the vaccine. Very quickly, we went into upscaling for clinical. That resulted into that we do in a 50-liter batch, a very small manufacturing plant, which we were using up to then. You fill in facilities where you fill up to 100,000 per batch, and that is in clinical filling is like the standard. Then that resulted in a clinical trial, 45,000 people. Today we have expanded that in South Africa in the Sisonke study with Professor Karim and great to 500,000 people learning about the South African strain, and hopefully we can get South African variant, and hopefully we can continue to prove the activity there. The upscaling, however, is something different. From there, we went from 50-liter batches. We have a very productive cell line which can produce 15,000 liters per batch, and that allows one drug substance facility to do 1 billion a year. And this that is, of course, a big challenge, but in the future, maybe an opportunity. But for COVID, we needed to go very big, very fast. And for filling, you have to go to 1 million per batch, otherwise it doesn't matter. We have to make sure that we can fill 5 per vial, 1 million per batch in order to make this large scale. And for the vaccine substance, we had one facility in Leiden. We found 3 additional in the world, but they are existing facilities. It takes 3 to 5 years to build such a facility. And for that, you need existing facility ready to use with specific, very special specifications, upstream and downstream, to get to enable to make that 1 billion vaccines. And that is a very challenging situation to do in the short term. You can, in the middle of a pandemic, as was said earlier by many people, you cannot start building facilities in a pandemic. They have to build between pandemics and therefore ready to use. And adding to what also was said, the capacity today, 3.5 billion vaccines, up to more than 10 billion are being produced now for COVID. So for the fill and finish, we scanned 100 facilities in the world, and now we are tech transferring to 9 different facilities in the world, including Aspen. And why Aspen? Because they were ready, they had all the capabilities, they had a BSL-2 environment, they had sterile end-to-end possibilities for live viral vectors, and they had the capacity with high throughput as well as the trained personnel. And that allowed us to go fast, and to within 12 months from starting the development, we now can deliver from the Aspen facility because we had ready-to-use facilities. And so what is needed? What as a large international company, what are we looking for? Is ready to use, quickly to adapt facilities where technology is there, people are there, trained talent, especially in sterility, which is not to be underestimated. If you produce in large quantities, if you fail a batch, you fail millions of vaccines. Quality systems and the regulatory environment which can cope with the quality as well as with the approval on the national level and particularly in international level. It was all there, and that allowed to take Aspen in a global facility in manufacturing. The tech transfer takes, first of all, it's all people with biology, molecular biology, virology capabilities, pharmaceutical training, quality, regulatory. It's a comprehensive end-to-end team you need in order to do that. You need sterile plants. For us, we need BSL-2, which is because we use a live, but it's a specialized plant and it needs to be a. And then what was said before, of course, we are just one technology. As we have there are egg-based, there are biological production processes, protein, mRNA. So each of the technologies for drug substance need different, and it's to invest in all at the same time. It's important to make a selection on where to focus and where to work on in different areas. And then it's time to result. J&J, large company, Janssen, large company in the world. It took us 10 years to do this, yeah, to go from a nascent technology, to go to good upscaling, to go to solid manufacturing process making this happen. So it requires a very long time investment to do this and to make it happen. So first, as a basis, long term is education, strong academic backgrounds, very strong people, a long-term vision to make it independent. And I think it's what John Casson said at the beginning is absolutely the future for Africa, is have that vision to do it. It's a long-term vision in health for prevention and treatment, but it's also financial and access to capital. This doesn't go without very significant financing and a sustainable business model. And that is very important, that you can't keep plants warm for 5 years with no work. That doesn't work. Yeah, it's not attractive for people there. It costs a lot of money. So the business case has to be there. The capital has to be there to fund it. And that then, of course, is connected to the demand, the funding of the demand in the region, and it will require a financial system to support it. We are very proud that we were able to transfer that quickly to Aspen, and that Aspen can now produce in the between 100 and 150 million vaccines per year for the African continent. So Peter, back to you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks for this is very down to earth and for this commitment to producing in Africa. And we now have another industry leader, Andrew Whitty, who, as you know, was the CEO of GSK and a huge vaccine producer, but also was instrumental in the ACT Accelerator in COVAX. And tech transfer is not just a technical issue, but there needs to be the right environment. So the question is really to you, Andrew, how can Africa be more attractive to tech transfer opportunities? What are the enablers that are needed to be in place?
Well, Peter, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here with fellow panelists. And I want to congratulate the African CDC and African Union for hosting this excellent conference. I'll try and keep my comments very short, Peter. I know time is pressing, and maybe cover 2 or 3 different aspects to try and answer your question. First of all, and I'm going to do this primarily from the perspective of the pandemic vaccine response, but like other speakers, I'm very optimistic about the potential for Africa to develop its own capabilities here beyond the pandemic situation. And there are clearly a lot of benefits to seeing a robust pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturing and research environment in Africa, which then helps response within a pandemic. But I'll make just 1 or 2 comments specifically from a pandemic perspective and lessons learned from COVAX perhaps, and 1 or 2 others. So first of all, I wish we'd had COVAX when we set CEPI up. If COVAX had existed properly before the pandemic, I think things would have been much better. I think even with all of the challenges, the performance of COVAX and its partners in delivering vaccines has been remarkably faster and better than anything we've seen before. But given that it had to be built during the crisis, clearly not perfect. So I would strongly urge continued commitment to a vehicle like COVAX, and use COVAX to really ensure that the wealthy countries have a sustained financing commitment to public health and vaccine development and procurement for nations of Africa and other nations of need. This has been something which I found very frustrating last year. There's a lot of talk, but when it came to it, the financing was slow to come. And that put COVAX in a difficult position to really deliver for the countries who are relying on it in Africa, for example. So that's the first point I would say. The second, global financing, there's been a lot of work done. IMF have been extremely outspoken on this, others as well. It's obvious that the investment in healthcare response is a tiny fraction of the financial and human disruption caused by a pandemic. It's also obvious, I think, that you shouldn't stop investing in preventing a pandemic when the current pandemic ends. And so as this current pandemic moves to control at some point in the next year or two, we need to make sure that we remember that against the trillions of dollars of global income and the millions of lives that have been disrupted across the whole world, the billions that might be required to invest properly for the next crisis is a tiny fraction. And so ensuring that the global community remain and actually rebuild a level of multilateral support and collaboration, in particular in support of Africa, I think is super critical here. Third thing I would ask for, I think we need a pandemic rule set. I think we've seen during the last 12 months, companies and governments on some occasions choose to follow a certain set of rules, on other occasions choose not to follow a certain set of rules. And as a result, we've seen a real spectrum of the ways in which different technologies have been brought into the environment. I think there could be a lot. I think we ought to be thinking much more about what are the rules that we expect to be applied in a global pandemic. It seems to me that the word global needs to be extremely defining of everything that happens after that word. There are very few situations where you would really seriously preface a conversation with the word global, but pandemic is one. And we all recognize that it requires us all to get safe, all to be protected before the world moves back to full normality. That, I think, bestows on technology owners, manufacturers, financiers, distributors, I think it requires us to operate in a different mode. And I think the rule set, some of which has been developed, so for example, we've seen great progress led by COVAX in development of things like indemnification of manufacturers, which has always been an extremely challenging issue in previous situations, now largely resolved. But on the flip side, we've seen very different approaches from companies. Some have gone non-for-profit, and you've heard two of those speakers today already, and huge credit to Andy Pollard and AstraZeneca, Oxford, and to Janssen and Paul. But not all companies have done that. And I struggle to understand that. I think we need to be really thoughtful about what is the deal that is put in place, what are the rule sets that are in place in a global pandemic situation. And then final couple of comments, Peter, really to speak to the tech transfer issues that we've been struggling with here. And again, from the lens of the pandemic. I think we have to be much more demanding about the notion of R&D design for manufacture. So I completely support the discovery strategy of great diversity. I mean, clearly you need multiple different technologies, you need multiple different ways of potentially arming yourself against an unknown pathogen or an unknown antigen. So that makes a ton of sense. What doesn't make any sense to me at all is why we use different size needles or different size vials or different size anything else, which actually is a commodity. And I think, you know, while in the normal manufacturing and the normal R&D environment, maybe you could justify that. I think in this situation, the downside consequence of permitting the customization of things which actually ought to be generic is massively complicating for a supply chain that you then need to try and expand in weeks, not years. And so really owning the concept of R&D design for pandemic manufacture ought to be part of the rule set. It ought to be something that we're super clear on. It's going to be really hard to build a responsive distributed manufacturing environment for fill finish or anything else if you continue to allow deep customization within aspects of the development process, which aren't mission critical. And I think in many cases, these are not mission critical. Last thing I would say is so discovery, the work that people like Andrew Pollard and Paul Stoffel's team have done is just remarkable. And thank goodness we have people who are able to synthesize knowledge out of thin air in the way that they have been able to do. I just want to focus though on the fill finish and the tech transfer aspect of vaccine scale. That's an engineering challenge. That's not a discovery eureka moment. It's an engineering challenge, and engineering challenges are highly responsive to invested dollars. So if you decide you want to put a man on the moon and you spend enough money, you will get them on the moon. You want a plane to fly beyond the speed of sound, it will fly beyond the speed of sound. It may take you years, it may cost you billions, but you'll get it done. That's very different to a discovery notion. I think we continue to struggle with fill finish, scale up and tech transfer because we haven't really invested the dollars to take our manufacturing processes into the 21st century. We're still essentially using manufacturing approaches which were, you know, they're kind of slicker, quicker, faster, but they're not really any different to the ones we were using 30, 40, 50 years ago. We should be spending, if we said globally, we are going to spend $1 billion just to focus on how to make fill finish scale up, plug and play, to make tech transfer actually not a super skill. Why can't we build technologies which don't require the super skilled individuals? Now, not easy to do, but not beyond humanity's creativity to be able to do that. So I am very I think it's exactly right that we should be looking to distribute manufacture into regions such as Africa. I think it's absolutely right. We should be ambitious to leverage the research minds of Africa, as I saw personally in the malaria vaccine, the Ebola vaccine programs. I think we need to be funding aggressively super modernization of our technology in the fill finish space with a goal of making it highly receptive to multiple different technologies, because we built standardization where it matters back into the R&D process, and technologies that don't require armies of the most rare tech transfer people on the planet. We need to develop technologies which can be used quickly. Let me give you one simple analogy. Our militaries across the world are capable of deploying the most sophisticated technologies at short notice into multiple different environments. Actually, the people who operate those technologies on the ground very often are not deeply trained in the technology that they're operating. They have been given an easy to use interface. If humanity has figured out how to do it in the military, shouldn't we now prioritize how to do it in healthcare? This is the time when we should be putting our investment dollars into arming the world against the pathogens. That's what I want us to do next. Peter?
Thank you so much, Andrew. And this brings another dimension, which I agree is hugely important. And And that's maybe also the opportunity for Africa, just as, you know, where you can take this, you know, this leap, if provided the new technologies are there and engineering investment. Thanks, was really very important contribution. Next, we have Charles Wolf from Sanofi Pasteur. Are you here? Let me see. I don't see you. If not, then let's go to the other side of the Atlantic and to Dr. Andre Zarur, who's the CEO of Greenlight Biosciences, and really a pioneering company with very innovative platform for, among other things, RNA technologies and so on. So you're the right person to tell us, since you also started up something, you know, something that's growing. Where would you start if you were an African manufacturer yourself?
Thank you, Dr. Piot, and thank you, Dr. Abdul Karim, for hosting this panel, and thank you to the African CDC and the African Union for hosting this very important conference. You're not going to like what I'm going to say, Peter, because I am going to disagree with a lot of what has been said. Look, I don't believe that pharmaceutical companies outside of Africa should be in charge of developing drug substance for Africa. I'm sorry, but I think Africa should have the capability of developing, producing, and scaling up their own drug substance, and evidently doing fill and finish and distribution. But I think the problem, and I don't mean to disrespect Andrew's assessment, but I think the problem is during a pandemic, rules go out the window. We can't even keep people from buying too much toilet paper. I mean, can you imagine if we told them that they couldn't have as many vaccines as they wanted? So I think at the end of the day, we need to enable African countries to leapfrog, to take that step of investing in manufacturing for the next millennia directly in Africa. I believe that just like we're not going to, you know, lay down fiber optic all over the continent to get high-speed internet, and we're going to leapfrog that technology and go straight to 5G, we need to leapfrog what has been done in other countries and figure out a way to do the appropriate technology transfer, developing processes that are ready for manufacture, scale them up, and enable the production locally. Furthermore, I believe that is absolutely possible. I believe that those facilities, and again, I'm going to disagree with another person that I admire enormously, so I am going to disagree with Dr. Stoffels. I think that we can build capacity for production of vaccines in Africa during this pandemic and not in between pandemics. I think that, for example, the mRNA technology, which can be rapidly scalable, can in fact be implemented in a relatively short period of time. I believe that with the right collaboration with companies sharing their intellectual property, licensing their products so they can be produced in Africa, and advances in manufacturing technology, facilities could be built in Africa that would serve the African continent. And eventually, in fact, have Africa become a net exporter of vaccines. These facilities would not only serve to get over this pandemic, would prepare us for the next pandemic, and would prepare us for the next series of epidemics that undoubtedly we'll have to face. Yes, it is true that it took 100 years for a global pandemic to come back again, but we have had outbreaks that have been deadly to countries, that have set back economies by decades, that we cannot afford to continue to have on a regular basis. And we cannot continue to rely on the goodwill of the rest of the world, because simply put, we can't really rely on global supply chains during a pandemic. So what is the solution? Well, we have one solution. Greenlight has one solution, but this is not about publicity for Greenlight. I believe that we need to implement systems in the African continent that allow to have not only the drug substance, but in fact the raw materials that are needed to make those vaccines present in the continent, managed in a regional continental basis, that are able to not only produce the vaccines, but in fact respond to new variants like the ones that were found in South Africa, to respond to future variants that we will have. I don't believe that we can wait around. I think that with investment and goodwill from the international community, the capacity to develop, scale up, and produce the vaccines in Africa is within reach. Now, it is important, however, the most important piece of this, however, is the question of technology transfer. We have to, in a very short period of time, train operators, obtain licenses for use, forge the public-private partnerships to implement the supply chain from beginning to end, and figure out manufacturing and distribution. That is not an easy task, as my fellow panelists have said. We have compressed 10 years, 15 years of typical vaccine development into 15 months. And now we're actually asking to do something that has never been done before, which is to have Africa leapfrog the rest of the world on manufacturing of pharmaceutical products. But I believe that if we put our efforts together, we can actually do that. We can implement technologies in recombinant protein manufacturing, as we said before, in mRNA technology, as we said before, which are at the point of a spear, and we can implement them locally in Africa. Now, as we move from ideas to action, it will take not only the goodwill of everybody who's in this conference and all the authorities within the African continent, it will also take investment from the international community. There is no way around that. And that will come with a realization that just as the virus doesn't know any borders, the investment to overcome this crisis and prepare for future ones should also know no boundaries. At the end of the day, I believe, and we have put together a plan that says that within 12 months, we could have mRNA manufacturing facilities up and running in the African continent. I believe other technologies, recombinant protein technologies, viral vector technologies, could in fact do the same. And we could, if we put our heads together and the appropriate funding, have basically every variant of the vaccine produced locally in the continent. I don't believe that we shouldn't try. I don't believe that we should settle for fill and finish. I believe that in order for Africa to not only overcome this crisis, but lead us into preparedness for the next pandemics.
Eu acho que nós devíamos estar preparados para a próxima pandemia.
So I guess that's a good point for me to stop.
No, that's not me. Please mute everybody. Yeah, please go ahead. No, continue.
No, I mean, just to wrap up, I think that technology...
Apenas para sintetizar, eu diria que...
Can you please mute everybody? Excuse me. Yes, Andre, please go on. Apologies.
No worries. As I was saying, I believe the technology exists. I believe the goodwill and the investment
E acredito na boa vontade.
Community exists. I believe the ability to
Eu acredito também na habilidade
technologies for the African continent is there.
Termos novas tecnologias ao nível.
I think Madalena, interpreter, can you please keep yourself on mute?
Interpreter.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, what we need to do is come together in a plan of execution. So I'm actually calling on all of my colleagues, which I hope I didn't disrespect by disagreeing with you, to really join forces and join brains in putting together a realistic plan for bringing all this breakthrough technologies to the continent and implement them in a period of time that will allow not only the African continent to get over this crisis by itself, but actually have the continent contribute to allow the rest of humanity to emerge from this crisis stronger than we have always been and much more united than we have ever been. Thank you. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, Andre, that's all right. You didn't disappoint me, certainly not. I was looking for the word leapfrogging but English is only my third language. Couldn't remember the term.
Only my second language, so.
Okay. So no, I think it's a good challenge, and one doesn't exclude the other. We need it all. So we have two more speakers. So we're moving well now. Now we have Dr. Francesco Balanda Scorza, who's the director of GSK Vaccines Institute for Global Health, which is a tradition in Siena to work on technologies and vaccines for low and middle income countries. So over to you, Francesco. Who are the most attractive tech transfer partners at the moment for African vaccine manufacturing? And we heard quite a spectrum already in this panel, but over to you, Francesco. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter, and thanks very much for the invite. So who are the most attractive tech transfer donors for African vaccine manufacturing? In terms of successful tech transfer models, there are certainly several different models for vaccines and vaccine technology transfer, and over 100 examples of transfer from developed to developing countries were reviewed a few years ago in a WHO document. These include EPI vaccines, but also new generation vaccines. Some are Me Too products, others include innovation and transfer of innovation. And so rather than attempting to review all different cases of tech transfer, I take this opportunity to explain the model that we have explored at GSK to support the development of innovative vaccines for global health and transfer innovation. So the GSK Vaccine Institute for Global Health, also known as GVGH, is one key component of a comprehensive GSK commitment to global health, specifically on infectious disease that affect the developing world. GVGH is in Siena, Italy, co-located at one of the 3 global GSK vaccine R&D centers, sharing the world-leading R&D facilities and expertise of the wider organization. We work very closely with our best experts in vaccine development, including Rino Rappuoli and Thomas Brewer, and many other experts we have in the company. The model we are following to develop new vaccines focuses on taking initial laboratory concepts and developing them through to clinical trials, typically up to phase 2B. And this is designed to prove the concept and de-risk the product. The next stage is for GVGH to identify a partner to complete the development of the vaccine. The goal for the model is local sustainability, so that ultimately the business is for the local manufacturer in a low or middle income country and not for GSK. In 2010, GVGH initiated its first program, bringing a new candidate, typhoid vaccine, to clinical trials. In 2013, with clinical proof of concept completed, we licensed the vaccine candidate to an Indian specialist biological E to continue its development. And in early 2020, the Indian Health Regulatory Authority approved the vaccine for manufacture, making it the first vaccine born in the GVGH labs and brought to market through an effective partnership. In December 2020, the GVGH BioE typhoid vaccine was pre-qualified by WHO, which expanded its availability through global organizations like Gavi. So transfer of technology is part of our model. We have so far focused on conjugate vaccines. We are working on a vaccine platform called GEMMA, which we are developing with our Shigella and invasive non-typhoidal Salmonella vaccine. Non-typhoidal Salmonella is an interesting case. This is a vaccine to prevent a disease prevalent and almost exclusively found in sub-Saharan Africa. GEMMA is a technology that was developed precisely to fit some of the criteria explained by Andy Whitty. We believe that if proven effective, it might just be the technology breakthrough that might allow for vaccine manufacturing in settings where there is less vaccine manufacturing expertise. Of course, we're constantly expanding our technology base with state-of-the-art technologies that we will continue to bring to global health. And currently, our development pipeline includes 5 products to prevent Shigella, invasive non-typhoidal Salmonella, typhoid and paratyphoid fever, and group A streptococcus. All these 5 products will start first in human trials in Europe over the next 18 months. So it took us 10 years to develop and transfer the first product. We're hoping to be faster for the current pipeline, but there have been a few learnings for sure. The first is that transfer is not enough, that the collaboration must continue up to the end through product deployed, and this includes regulatory and clinical interactions. That we must work with stakeholders, Stage, Gavi, WHO, to be ready to go and go together with local manufacturing. And that the transfer needs to be a high priority to the local manufacturer, and they need to be involved early on. So back to the question, who are the most attractive tech transfer donors and for African vaccine manufacturer? Well, based on our experience with transferring products and technology to India, tech transfer from an experienced manufacturer is ideal. This entity should have manufacturing experience, but also experience with tech transfer. And on the receiving side, capacity needs to be built over time to implement technology. Only later, with the experience of absorbing technology and commercializing product, then tech transfer could come from a biotech. And I want to say why we think there is value for GSK in doing these things. I mean, there is enormous pride and employee motivation working for a company that cares about global health. And also importantly, though, innovation for low and middle income countries can generate innovation for both sides. So I'll end here saying that this model is what we're championing, that it can be applied for vaccines that are critical for Africa, whether for prevention of endemic diseases or for pandemic preparedness. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Peter. Thanks very much again for the invite.
Thank you, Francesco. These are very practical experiences. This also illustrates these things don't fall out of the sky. You know, there's a lot of you know, preparatory work and I guess positive and negative experiences, and then you can move ahead. So we have then we go to our last panelist, last but not least, Dr. Peter Wilson. It's from a different perspective, from the African Leadership Institute, and this is about what is this kind of support from local governments? Do vaccine manufacturers need to be attractive to technology partners? What is crucial for sustaining and sustainability in such partnerships? Over to you, Peter. I can't see you, but
thank you, Peter. And like Francesco, I'll try and be brief. It will come as no surprise to you that as the co-founder of the African Leadership Institute, I believe that leadership will be important for the success of technology transfer. Strong political leadership to champion the initiative is vital, not only in the short term, but a long-term commitment to the sustainability of the venture. We're seeing great political leadership being shown now by the African Union and the African CDC. But this is not an 800-meter race. This is a marathon. And that political leadership must be sustained for the long term in order for success in technology transfers. So the political leadership will be required in the countries to promote the concept of manufacturing industry to flourish. And it has to be consistent in maintaining the support for a decade or more, so as to develop an effective vaccine manufacturing hub will take many, many, many years. Further, it must be recognized that until economies of scale are reached, local manufacture can be more expensive than importing. And the tech transfer partner will look to government to maintain a commitment to local manufacture as a preferential supplier. But if you take a holistic perspective, there are significant social and developmental benefits that at least partially offset the cost advantage and justify taking this role of supporting local manufacture. But risk reduction is very important for a tech transfer. And apart from a commitment to local manufacture, it will be very important as part of the tech transfer arrangement upfront to have an uptake commitment from the local government. In other words, the local government will agree that it will take a minimum volume of vaccine from the new facility when it is completed. This advanced market purchase arrangement was very important in the Manfacturing arrangements with Serum Institute and underpinned the tech transfer arrangements. And I see this as a vitally important point in any tech transfer arrangement in Africa. Ideally, the uptake commitment should be a regional or a continental one in order to achieve the economies of scale and create an Africa-wide vaccine manufacturing industry. As many people have said before, economies of scale are vital in order to keep the costs down and to ensure that there's a sustainability. And here again, local political leadership will be important in establishing and oiling the regional and continental connections that will be needed to achieve the goals we're talking about today. Then there's the enabling environment, which is vital for a successful tech transfer. So there are many other initiatives that will be required of government to support and sustain a productive enabling environment for tech transfer and vaccine development and manufacture. Because we're not only talking about manufacture, I believe, as other speakers have said, it's important to have the research and development element as an important part of the development of the vaccine manufacturing industry in Africa. So the enabling environment includes the financing and incentives, a good supporting educational, industrial and scientific infrastructure, and a research and development culture so that people can actually evaluate the different possible technologies and put in place the scientific support mechanisms which are required. But perhaps one very important element that stands out for tech transfer, that is a strong and knowledgeable regulatory agency. And preferably, African countries should collaborate to form an African regulatory authority, and I'm pleased to hear today that there are moves in this direction, because to have 54 different regulatory authorities to approve a vaccine or to approve a development process is just not sustainable. Finally, a win-win partnership between the tech transfer donor, the local manufacturer, and the local government is also very important. A public-private partnership with equal weight to all parties. It's not dominated by any particular party. Each party has a different set of objectives and priorities, and if this partnership is to be sustainable and successful, compromises have to be made on all sides to enable each party to achieve most of these objectives in an equitable partnership. So in summary then, the main support that will be required from local government is a political leadership committed to the long-term sustainability of the venture, establishing and maintaining a productive, enabling environment, oiling the wheels to enable a regional continental approach to the venture, and establishing and maintaining a win-win public-private partnership. So thank you, Peter, and back over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And indeed, leadership is important, but also the initiative to develop an African Medicines Agency is extremely important. Even in Europe, it was a qualitative step forward. Let's hope that all the stars become aligned now. I'd like to now go ask Slim to take over for the rest of the session. Over to you, Slim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to all our speakers. I think you will all agree with me that we have been treated to an amazing set of conversations that really give us grounds to be optimistic and to give us grounds to give us a way forward. I'm going to, given the time that we have available, which is just about 5 minutes or so, I'm going to take the prerogative just to ask one question and to direct that question before I try and summarize the discussions that we've had. So the one key question that has come, and it's come from a range of different individuals, but Satya was the one who clarified the question, distilled it, which is, if we're looking at a one world scenario and looking at capacity that already exists in Africa, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and various other countries to manufacture animal vaccines, is that the kind of platform we should be looking at to try and build and leapfrog into human vaccines in the kind of way that Dr. Nkengasong, in his beautiful diagram, he showed how in Africa we need these 5 regional capacities in which to tech transfer and to build, because we've already heard Dr. Stoffels and Sawiti showed it to us quite clearly that this is not something that's going to happen overnight. We need to have an existing platform. And, there's a superb African saying that, when is the best time to plant a tree? Well, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best time is to plant it now. So I want to just hear from Dr. Stoffels and Sawiti their thoughts about using existing capacity in Africa for animal vaccines. Is that a platform to think about in terms of the way forward? So I'll ask Paul to comment first.
Slim, can I just interrupt? Sorry, because I was just told that Charles Wolfe is is also on the platform, which I didn't know, but maybe he can come in there now in this
Okay.
question. Oh,
I'll
sorry.
ask him to comment as well, and I'll bring him into this
Apologies,
conversation.
because
Thanks, Peter. Paul, floor is
just a short answer. I think all capabilities which are there to produce vaccines, whether it's animal, I think that will help. Of course, there are a lot of different technologies and different scientific and pharmaceutical capabilities are needed for those, and therefore specialty organizations, certain organizations have to focus on certain areas of technology because you can't do it all. But I think it's a very good basic capability. And then, of course, with the collaboration of academic and Gary, the NIH network, the MRC networks, and collaborating on building the scientific knowledge in the countries to develop vaccines. And while you develop vaccines, create a manufacturing capacity. That's how biotechs do it, yeah, and that's how new companies do it with new technologies. And I think it's a combination of existing capabilities with good new research, which could form the basis for future vaccine industry in Africa.
And maybe,
thanks, Paul.
Maybe to jump on this, I think I'm not a veterinary expert, but Sanofi Pasteur used to be at the beginning of its history, also growing from veterinary vaccines a long time ago. I speak about 1 century ago. And it's definitely something you can leverage. For me, what is very important is to insist on the stepwise approach. So you need to start to go from the downstream to the upstream, to develop capabilities. And you need to have a very long-term vision. It has been insisted by many stakeholders in the previous sessions in order to build long-term sustainable capacities for the vaccines industry in Africa. It has been raised by Morena. It's something that you build also more between 2 pandemics than during a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Wolf. You want to add anything else while you have the floor, Charles?
Yeah, I think something that we discussed about vision, we discussed a lot about the vision between the partners. I will insist on the fact that beyond the 2 partners' vision shared, I think it's very important that their local ecosystem is also completely aligned with their vision. And this is extremely important because we need, in order to develop local manufacturing in the countries, some consistency of the regulation, of the market access, in order to build long-term capacities. We discussed about complexity of tech transfer that takes up to 10 years. And so you need to know in advance, 10 years in advance, that the market conditions, the regulatory conditions will remain consistent. And for this, you need that the entire ecosystem is going to be well aware and well aligned on the visions between the 2 partners.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Wolf. I'm going to ask Sawiti. Andrew, you want to comment on the question of what platforms would give us a launching pad?
Sir, Andrew had to leave to another meeting, so he's no longer with us. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. And perhaps if I can ask Dr. Hatchett, Richard, your thoughts on that? Because you talked about a globally distributed capacity that CEPI is building, and you described it in a very eloquent way. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the globally distributed capacity, I think I wouldn't say that we're building it. We envision its necessity, and I think that having a globally distributed capacity in Africa that is also diversified in terms of the technologies that it represents and in terms of the ongoing diseases that it addresses will be critical for sustainability. It will be critical for building a workforce, for building the ecosystem that many of the other speakers have emphasized will be critically important if this capacity is to be sustained. I think the opportunity to create that capacity and to populate that ecosystem and to bring the skills and the workforce together and the regulatory environment together, there probably has never been a greater opportunity. And we've heard lots of great ideas across the course of the discussions today that are instantiations of that, and I think we need to build on the momentum going forward.
Thanks very much, Richard. So in the remaining 3 minutes that we have, I don't think we have any time for any further time for questions. I'll just try and capture, I mean, I can't do justice to an amazing, rich and nuanced session, but I'll try and just capture some of the points that have been so eloquently articulated in this session. I think I'll start with just kicking us off with what Dr. Zaru talked about, which is, we need to develop local ownership. We need to have locally empowered companies, and we need to be thinking about African capacity to develop vaccines. And that we have to think about this in a way in which I think Dr. Stoffels captured it best, is we need to think about it in a long-term vision. And I think we heard from Dr. Wolf about we've got to be thinking about it in a long-term view. He talked about a 10-year view. And I think the way in which Dr. Stoffels touched on it was that in this long-term vision, we need to have at least 3 key elements amongst others, which is the people with the necessary skills, the financing and the sustainable business models, and the access to technology. And in that regard, we heard from Professor Pollard about that as we look at technologies, we've got to keep in mind that we want to keep some flexibility, that we can't just commit to one platform. He articulated very well the 4 platforms we currently are using for SARS-CoV-2, and he talked about the way in which we need to be thinking about that flexibility. But we heard from Dr. Hatchett that as we think about these technologies, we've got to be thinking about both levels of the way in which we refer to manufacturing. The one is the fill and finish capacity, and the other one is actual vaccine manufacture. And the way in which to do that in a globally distributed way so that the entire world has that kind of capacity. And here we're just focusing on Africa and the need for Africa to be able to do that in terms of supporting this kind of diverse platforms. And we heard from Sawiti that this is not going to come if we don't take a sustained political and financial approach. And I like the way he said, don't stop investing in pandemics when the pandemics are waning. You've got to really invest in a sustained way. That building for that future, in terms of using the African tree analogy, you don't stop putting water on the tree you've planted just because it's a cloudy day. You prepare to create that tree to give you shade in the future, and you don't know when you're going to need that shade, so you water the tree all the time. And the way in which we've got to be able to do that. And I think we heard from Dr. Scosa that part of fast tracking that is to look at who's ready to go, who's got the most experience, what are the technologies we can transfer the fastest. And just to end off that all of that wisdom that we've heard today. I mean, what we've had the honor of hearing today is from people who've actually done this, who actually made vaccines. And as I remember sitting across the discussions with Dr. Stoffels, it's about a shared vision. We all need to create a society that is better prepared and ready to take on these challenges. And we're not going to be able to do it individually. We're not going to be able to do this in isolation. We're going to be able to do this because we can create mutually beneficial partnerships. And so I want to thank all of today's panelists for really sharing their wisdom with us and for coming forward and giving us ideas about how to realize this vision. And I'd like to end off on two notes. The first is just to apologize for today being an all-male panel. Peter and I had this long discussion a few weeks ago about, both of us committed never to chairing panels or being part of panels, and panels being all-male panels in the future. But our best efforts really failed, and I have no excuses other than to say, we'll do better next time in ensuring we do not have another panel talking on this subject. But I want to end off by thanking the African CDC, thanking Dr. Nkengasong for his vision, his leadership, his commitment. It's been nothing short of amazing. I've had the opportunity of working with him now for over a year on this problem, and I have only come away with even more support and enthusiasm for what he is doing. And to the African Union, because none of what we're talking about, none of these sustained financing models, none of this capacity building, none of this effort, because we're not talking only about making vaccines in this conference. We're talking about the full value chain. There's about the raw materials, there's about the syringes, the needles, the intellectual capacity, the academic capacity, not just the engineering capacity and the clinical capacity. So it's across this entire spectrum. We're going to be able to do that if we know we have the support. We have the political support, we have the financial support, and that it's not just at that kind of level, because I think all of us know we cannot continue by simply, throwing out platitudes. We need a creative discussion, we need a vision, we need a way forward, and we need people with commitment to take that path, to actually walk the walk. Thank you very much to all of you, and I'd like to hand over back to Dr. Muita and Dr. Nkengasong. A great pleasure. Thank you to all our speakers and to my co-moderator, Dr. Pierre.
Thank you, Professor Salim Abdul Karim and Professor Piot. Thank you for a very enlightening and wonderful session. I don't need to, I don't need to summarize anything you've said, because you've said it very eloquently and clearly. From scarcity being the enemy of equity, and to the necessity for developing partnerships and channels through which technology transfer can take place, for Africa to up its game in vaccine manufacturing. Thank you very much. When we talk about technology, sometimes it's necessary to spare a thought for those to whom the technology belongs. So in our next session, we are going to talk about intellectual property transfer. And this session will focus on current challenges faced in intellectual property sharing, motivating factors and drivers for successful IP sharing and licensing, enablers and unlocks for IP sharing in Africa, and of course, the role of TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which is a WTO instrument, in vaccine manufacturing and potential flexibilities and incentives. And to take us through this session, the two co-conveners for this session are Her Excellency Professor Sarah Anyang Agbor. Thank you. She will put a break to the panel that has just ended. She is the Commissioner for Education, Science and Technology and Innovation within the African Union Commission. And to help her do this will be Honorable Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the Minister of Health in the Republic of South Africa. So over to you, Your Excellency Anyang and Honorable Mkhize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tata. Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a chain. We've been transferring from one stage to the other. This conference is a historic and an inspiration, and we want to thank the chair of the African Union Commission for organizing and pulling in people from all different walks of life. And congratulations to my brother, Dr. John Nkengasong, and the Department of Health and Humanitarian, led by my sister, Commissioner Amira, I am honored to co-moderate this session with Honorable Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the Minister of Health, Republic of South Africa. We earlier had a chat together. Honorable, I believe you're online already. Yes, I can see you now. Thank you very much. Intellectual property transfers help vaccine manufacturers attain the required permission to use existing licenses to produce vaccines safely, efficiently, and competitively. Transfer of licenses to use vaccine formulations or vaccine production processes are protected by laws that may limit vaccine manufacturing, particularly for smaller or newer manufacturers. One vaccine may have several IP rights that all need to be acquired before that vaccine can be produced by another manufacturer. There are advantages to partnerships based on intellectual property transfer between large vaccine manufacturers and smaller vaccine producers. Some of these advantages include entry into new markets, increase in volume of vaccine produced, or regional expansion into hard-to-reach markets. Despite these advantages, IP owners need strong incentives to share their intellectual property, especially for non-financial reasons. I was so excited when I listened to Dr. Udre Zeruri saying that Africa can produce gas, and we can do that by leapfrogging and sharing IP rights among ourselves. Now, the need for an African vaccine production and manufacturer, as we listen to the distinguished speakers and presidents at the opening session, is critical for building strong resilient systems for Africa that we want. And I also heard in the session that manufacturing is said to be an economy of scale. So DVCMs and MNCs support the transfer of intellectual property as part of their efforts to make vaccine supply available to developing countries. An enabling environment is important for successful IP transfer. This includes the capacity for local manufacturers to successfully use IP effectively and profitably, the protection of valuable IP rights owned by MNCs, and demonstrable impact created by affordable, accessible, and safe vaccines. DVCMs and MNCs have different incentives to facilitate IP transfers. These incentives should be understood, and the drivers of IP sharing partnerships should be explored for sustainability to be achievable. Recently, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, commonly called TRIPS waivers, have become relevant topics internationally, with India and South Africa leading efforts to remove IP limitations on local vaccine production. In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic accentuated the desire for countries to produce their own vaccines for the public health security of their citizens. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, a few countries like Brazil have developed policies that have allowed local vaccine production by leveraging the production of TRIPS. Today, African countries are likely in favor of TRIPS waivers. However, the implication of TRIPS must be well understood for sustainable vaccine production in Africa to ensure that IP holders, local manufacturers, and all African citizens benefit from well-regulated vaccine production. This now leverages the importance of Section 4 on intellectual property transfer, and it also underscores the importance of the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization that was adopted by the African Head of State in January 30, 2016, because IP is important for our African indigenous knowledge and traditional pharmacopoeia knowledge, as well as IP on vaccine production. To discuss this important topic on African vaccine manufacturing for health security, Section 4 on intellectual property rights, I'll be co-moderating with His Excellency Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the Minister of Health, Republic of South Africa, who has served in both national and provincial spheres of government as Minister of COPTA, Premier of the province of KwaZulu-Natal. We also have on board our brother, His Excellency, was Emile Mene, the Secretary General, African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. We had him earlier at the opening session. His Excellency Wakele, prior to his current role, has served as Chief Director, African Economic Relations at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa. In this role, he was South Africa's chief trade negotiator in the AFTA and tripartite FTA negotiations. We also have Honorable Dr. Abdullahi Sabri Fadul, the Minister of Public Health and National Solidarity, Republic of Chad. He was appointed Minister of Public Health and National Security on the 14th of July 2020. And over the past decade, Dr. Fadul has accumulated a wealth of professional experience at the ministerial level in Chad, including within the ministries of government responsible for relations with the National Assembly and reforms, government, post and telecommunications, justice, and state control. He holds a doctorate degree in law. Then we have Mr. Thomas Kearney, the Director General, International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturing and Association, who represents the innovative biopharmaceutical industry on the WHO's access to COVID-19 tools, ACT Accelerator. He is chair of the business at OECD Health Committee and serves as industry co-chair of the APEC Biopharmaceutical Working Group on Ethics, among others. Then the only lady that breaks the chain of a male panel is Dr. Marie Angela Simao, the Assistant Director General, Access to Medicines and Health Products, World Health Organization. Dr. Maria Angela Simao joined WHO in November 2017 as part of Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus WHO Director General Leadership Team. She previously worked for UNAIDS since September 2010, and prior to that, she worked for the Ministry of Health in Brazil as the Director of the Sexually Transmitted Diseases, HIV and viral. Bian Glenn, Chief Intellectual Property Unit, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Mr. MS, leads UNCTAD Intellectual Property Unit at the Division on Investment and Enterprise.